Hey, I want to ask you guys something. When was the last time you read a poem? And not just a TikTok slideshow poem, but one that made you feel really deeply, one that made you reflect on life or love or nature. Today, I want to talk about poetry of the Romantics and Romanticism. I want to talk about why it was so integral to art and culture and why now we have completely strayed away from it. I think we should begin by identifying what Romanticism is. Romanticism was an artistic, intellectual, and literary movement which began in the 18th and 19th centuries. It put a lot of emphasis on emotion, nature, individualism, and the sublime. Some key figures of this period would include William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Mary Shelley, John Keats, and Percy Shelley. A quote which I think perfectly encapsulates exactly what I'm talking about is from Wordsworth himself, where he stated that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. The core of Romantic poetry really relied on three main pillars. The first of which is the emphasis on nature, the emphasis on emotion and imagination, as well as individualism and freedom. For Romantic poets, nature wasn't just a backdrop. It was the ultimate source of inspiration. It was a sanctuary for the soul, or a mirror for the human experience. Romantic poets didn't just write poetry about landscapes, but rather more focused on the profound connection between the natural world and the human spirit. In William Wordsworth's work entitled Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey, he reflects on how nature shaped his inner self over time. As a young man, he marveled at its beauty, and as he grew older, he began to see nature as a source of wisdom and emotional resilience. In this poem, he writes, "For I have learned to look on nature, not as in the hour of thoughtless youth, but hearing oftentimes the still, sad music of humanity." Here we can see how Wordsworth has matured in his relationship with nature. It was used as a way to help him process confusing, deeper feelings about life as a whole. What's interesting about this aspect of Romantic poetry was that it was a direct response to the Industrial Revolution. We are seeing cities expand, machines dominate, and as this is all happening, we are watching people gradually get more and more disconnected from Earth and the natural world. The Romantic poets saw this and as a response created works like these almost to draw us back to our more wild side. And I will come back to the idea of modern society and the value shift from beauty to practicality, how that ties into the disconnectedness of poetry that we feel as a society today. The second large theme of emotion and imagination is one that I really find interesting to dive deeply on, because in our society we are so prevalent in the idea of almost shaming ourselves for feeling things deeply, loving strongly and unashamedly. Romantic poetry gives permission to feel things embarrassingly deep, like how I feel everything. Whether it was overwhelming joy, heart-wrenching sorrow, passionate love, or unfulfilled longing, this emotional intensity was never seen as a weakness, but rather as a strength and an essential part of human experience. One of my favorite poems of all time, from one of my favorite poets of all time, John Keats, in Ode to a Nightingale, he dives deeply into the interesting intersection of joy and sorrow, and how the two interconnect. The Nightingale's song forces him to imagine a world where, beyond human suffering, there is a timeless and ethereal beauty that seems almost within reach, but not quite. And as the poem unfolds, Keats is slowly brought back to reality and the mortifying ordeal of being known and alive, if you will. Consider these lines. "Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. No hungry generations tread thee down. The voice I hear this passing night was heard. in ancient days by emperor and clown. So the Nightingale's song becomes something more symbolic of something eternal and unchanging, offering a temporary escape from reality. Which, hey, I love a temporary escape from reality, doesn't everyone? But by the end of the poem, Keats is faced with the inevitable reality that human life is finite and death is inescapable. But what a joy that is. Let me just take a sip of my little strawberry tequila drink. Romantic poetry kind of became sort of an emotional map. It began charting the highs and lows of human emotions and imaginations and experiences. It was never demonstrated as something to be feared, but something to be proud of and embraced and explored, because these are the very things that make us human in our essence. A lot of romantic works remind us that imagination isn't just for escapism, but rather a way of making sense of the world around us and figuring out what our place within all of this is. And by engaging in these poems, we're forced to face the grim reality of death. However, there is great privilege in this, in that we do it through the lens of joy of existence, if that makes sense. The individual is set at the center of romantic philosophy, celebrating personal experiences, personal emotions, as well as freedom from constraining societal norms. At a time when there was rigid structures of class, tradition, and industrialization was ultimately shaping people's lives, Romantic poets kind of championed the idea of true happiness and freedom coming from within and from breaking out of those societal barriers that were built up by society. They valued self-expression and authenticity way more than conforming to societal rules as a path to happiness, which was very much rejected by the Romantics. Lord Byron's poem entitled She Walks in Beauty is often read as a love poem, and it should be, it's lovely. But at its core, it is a striking example of romantic emphasis on the individual's unique experience of beauty as well as emotion. The poem reads, "She walks in beauty like the night, of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes." The idea here is that Byron is not describing her beauty through the conventional beauty standards that society held for women at the time, but rather he's captivated by this woman in a more spiritual and personal way. This woman is not just physically beautiful, but she embodies a harmony of light and darkness, and somehow has found a happy medium between the two. And Byron's poetry often reflects the romantic idea of freedom, not just political or societal freedom, but freedom also of the mind and the spirit. He often defied the expectations set on him by his aristocratic background, and he pursued a life of adventure and self-expression. Romantic poets and poems, especially this poem by Lord Byron, really reminds us that beauty in its essence is a very personal thing, and that finding freedom truly is from finding peace with who you are deep in yourself, completely separate from the expectations of others. And in a world where societal pressures and strange conventions of beauty are still so prominent, romantic poetry, all these years later, is still beneficial in allowing us to find beauty in what is authentically us. Now, there are many reasons why I believe that we have strayed so far from the ideology of the Romantics and romantic poetry and just poetry in general. But here are a few main pillars of why I believe that we have strayed so far. Number one, modern life as fast-paced. We live in a society that is so heavily based around instant gratification. Short form videos, TikToks, tweets, reels, bite-sized content designed to keep you watching for as long as you possibly can because you give me more money, give me money, give me money. Whereas poetry, especially romantic poetry by contrast, demands our undivided attention and reflection. And candidly, I think that deep reflection, individual reflection, is so hard for people now, especially in our generation. It's very uncomfortable to reflect on yourself and on your feelings. I feel like we've gotten so good at numbing ourselves from all of the pain that we feel that the thought of confronting that pain head on, or that immense love, it's almost impossible. As a society, I think that we all have a hard time investing in things emotionally, and that is exactly what poetry is. It is an emotional investment. We prioritize what's fast and consumable, and in doing so, we often miss out on the richness and depth and real meaning that poetry has. And in that same vein, the idea of us being so heavily reliant on technology, and the first thing I talked about was how the Romantics focused primarily on the miracle of nature. But the unfortunate reality is that many of us, our experience of nature is through a scroll on social media, or the brief walk to the bus stop or the grocery store, which we spend most of that time on our phones anyways. And I don't want to sound like one of those people that's like, you're always on that damn phone, but like, we really are always on that damn phone. Like, it's an inescapable reality at this point. And this disconnect from nature itself, it's no wonder that we have such a hard time as a generation and as a society reconnecting with poetry, because it is fundamentally fueled by the beauty and admiration of nature, which we have, a lot of us, been disconnected from for quite a long time now. This perfectly brings me into my next point of poetry being perceived as impractical, inaccessible, or elitist. I feel like a lot of times when you bring up poetry or romantic poetry or Shakespeare, it always reminds people of their high school days, which are usually not pleasant memories. You know, it kind of seems like its own completely different language filled with metaphors that don't really mean much to us anymore. Especially romantic poetry, it can feel very antiquated. And oftentimes people can judge it prior to experiencing it in thinking that the themes are irrelevant to modern life, which is completely wrong. And I think this is further commentary on how this perception is compounded by the way that poetry is taught, how it is dissected through examinations or essays without ever really appreciating it as art. For example, I always thought that it was so stupid that we would read Shakespeare and then write essays on it rather than going to see the play. In a world where practicality often outweighs beauty, the introspective and symbolic nature of romantic poetry is often dismissed and considered quite indulgent. The next point I want to make is the grand shift in cultural values that we are seeing now as a society. As previously stated, the Romantics celebrated introspection and the pursuit of beauty, whereas now we live in a society where burnout is almost seen like a badge of honor. We are measured by our productivity and immeasurable success, rather than admiring the simplicity of life. So you may be asking, why does this even matter? Why does this matter at all? I think the reasons why we have strayed away from romantic poetry and poetry in general has a much deeper commentary on modern life. It seems like we've lost touch with the very things that make us human in the first place. Poetry and all forms of art force us to pause and let ourselves have time to appreciate these things about life and these things that make us human beings. Hey guys, my camera just died. So we're having a little change of scenery here, but don't worry, I will continue. So I want to talk now a little bit about why I'm making this video, why I think that poetry matters so much. And I'm not saying anything profound or that you've never heard before when I say that our society has a real issue with facing emotions head on. Every time you open up TikTok, here's 5 ways to get over this. Here's 6 ways to make this person want you. Here's 7 ways to manipulate this person into thinking that they want you when really they don't actually want you. For the last 2 years, and this is kind of a personal thing for me, but I feel it's important to talk about right now considering the content of this video, I had completely dulled my light and tried to completely eviscerate any feelings or emotions that would come up as a coping mechanism. That is not an uncommon practice in our society today, especially in our generation, if you are a Gen Z like myself. And I think there is a huge miscalculation regarding how shutting down your feelings completely is like an alpha thing to do, and it's like I'm badass because like I don't feel anything and I don't let anyone make me feel things. The Romantics encouraged us to feel everything fully. Don't listen to my sink. Whether that be joy, happiness, or sorrow, nostalgia, pain, despair, whatever you feel it with your whole being, because that is what life is about. It's just about feeling. There's no grand mystery to our existence. It's just this. And I find it a great shame that we spend our whole lives trying to find a reason or a purpose when we have art all around us showing us plain as day that the purpose is this. I think that poetry can really help build emotional resilience in our society, and I think that the issue with the term emotional resilience is that people may take emotional resilience as not feeling emotions at all, when it's the complete opposite. It's feeling everything and being able to accept it as a fact and let go of it. In conclusion, I want to express that we still study poetry and the Romantics and Shakespeare in school for a reason. It's not just because it was thrown on the curriculum because that's just, people are lazy and that's what they want to teach you just because. It's not that at all. These themes transcend time. They transcend culture and they transcend circumstance. And I don't know how you can't appreciate the incredible fact that despite a universe that is constantly changing and constantly evolving, these themes, these ideas of love and poetry and beauty, they remain constant throughout all of this. To pursue the complete annihilation of that, what a waste. I think that poetry is so important, not only because it opens a window into the past, but also because it also speaks directly to our contemporary struggles and aspirations. Everybody has heard of like the loneliness epidemic. Everyone is so lonely. Why are people in their 20s more lonely than ever? Like, what's going on? We live in an age that fosters disconnection and division. And whether that be through technology as well as the people who we put in power, this division will lead to our destruction. Art and poetry, it calls us to reconnect with these emotions, with nature, with eternal themes of love and passion and devotion and beauty, as well as sadness and despair and depression. And these things, these words may have been written centuries ago, but its power to still invoke inspiration and to give pause, I think will truly be what allows us to be led back to what really matters. But what do I know?